I may use terminology differently than that you use it. So just take that into account and be friendly with me after. Is it okay if I sometimes sit? Thank you. So I'm going to take you back into time. 16th, 17th century, the Americas. So after the Spanish decided to explore, expand, and colonize parts of the world unknown to them, as soon as that happened, missionaries joined on that quest to convert the local peoples, the local indigenous peoples. And they entered in the Americas in what would become the viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, which is Mesoamerica and South America at the western border. They met with a highly diverse cultural and linguistic landscape, many different kind of peoples, all with their own cultural entities, speaking different languages. 100 more than hundreds of languages were spoken. The Spanish perceived Nahuatl being some sort of lingua franca in the what would become New Spain area, mostly Mexico and some parts of other countries there, and Quechua. In the South America area. But the missionaries realized that, of course, there were a lot more languages spoken, and colonial policy was really tied to the evangelization project. So even though that the crown promoted Spanish to be used by the inhabitants of these viceroyalties, they actively encouraged missionaries to learn the local indigenous languages for purposes of efficient evangelization. And while their main focus was on these major languages like Nahuatl and Quechua, they also took it upon the task themselves to study the many local languages as well. And so the encounter with all these different peoples and the need of evangelization encouraged these missionaries not just to learn the languages, but also to codify the linguistic knowledge that they learned on paper. There were 4 main groups of religious orders that actively contributed to this: the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and Jesuits, and they really eagerly studied, learned, documented these indigenous languages, of course, which was only possible with the willingness of the indigenous collaborators sharing linguistic knowledge to them. And this ended up in a large-scale production of handwritten but also printed books on indigenous languages and about in indigenous languages and about indigenous languages. And this is from a prologue of a Nahuatl grammar by Alonso de Molina. And it really goes to show the objective of why he codified linguistic knowledge. It says, considering how many servants of God come here to help save these natives, and to support their pious and charitable intention, I have endeavored to write many things in the Mexican language. So you also see that these language descriptions are closely tied to the evangelization project. And then that ends up being what I call missionary linguistic knowledge, being separate from indigenous linguistic knowledge, because it's really produced with the aim to serve evangelization. Of course, they'd learned the local languages, learning to speak and understand these languages, but it was missionary oriented. It was really meant to be used for conversion. Of course, these grammars, vocabularies, and also translations of religious texts produced in Europe were also shaped within this European framework. The grammars were, for instance, based on Antonio de Nebrija. Vocabularies were based on European models created in Europe, but then transferred to a local context. It is therefore inherently ideological and instrumental. It's what Rubies has called savoir missionnaire. So it's not purely indigenous linguistic knowledge, it's really a separate set that they can use, that they can utilize while converting the local indigenous peoples. And of course, as I mentioned before, it was only possible because of the indigenous informants sharing knowledge on these languages. They were not passive bystanders. They actively contributed to the creation of this missionary linguistic knowledge. Unfortunately, the works themselves barely acknowledge the essential role that these actors played in writing, printing, disseminating, and using these texts. So what are we talking about? There's actually selected of two main categories of missionaries books that were directly used for evangelization. In the first place, language descriptions like grammars and vocabularies, really to learn indigenous languages on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the religious translations like catechisms, sermon books, prayer books, manuals for administering sacraments, all intended to help instruct fellow missionaries on how to evangelize local communities by offering translations in these languages. So the purpose was not to necessarily facilitate communication. It was really, I think you get the message. It was set on converting these peoples. And we should also look at these different books as some sort of integrated instrumentarium, so to speak, toolbox that you needed if you wanted to convert people. You needed to learn the language. You needed to be able to convey the word of God in these languages based on the materials that they created. These books are important on its own. Lisa Roberts has written on knowledge circulation, and she says, knowledge cannot exist or travel on its own in our material world. It needs a physical carrier, whether that's a human, a book, an illustration. Knowledge needs to be embodied. And material carriers like manuscripts or printed books are more permanent bodies to codify knowledge and to disseminate or distribute knowledge to others. Of course, you can also orally exchange knowledge with others, but by putting it or codifying it in a book, you have a more permanent form to contain and to distribute this knowledge. What is important is, of course, looking at the books themselves, is that they actively transform knowledge through processes such as writing, editing, printing, translating, revising, and reissuing. These processes all impact on the way the knowledge is conveyed to others. And that's what I did in my research and what book historians do. Book historians look at books not just as static carriers of knowledge, but as physical cultural objects in their own right, with specific forms and functions and social purposes. And in this research, in all the research I actually do, I look at the interplay between the materiality of the books, the sociality, and the spaces of production. The materiality implies the physical characteristics of the books. The sociality is looking at the actions and motives of the participants involved in the production of these books. And the spaces of productions is looking at local circumstances. So looking into physical spaces, the infrastructure, for instance, of the printing industry, but also looking at what the framework is, the regulating framework is to get books published and getting permission from the authorities. For me, it's also important that we recognize this distinction between the intellectual production of texts or the creative process of producing knowledge, of writing, rewriting, adapting, correcting, editing, readers interacting with the contents of texts, and the material and technical production of books, which also implies really putting your pen to paper to write stuff, designing books, structuring into chapters with navigational elements, printing with actually putting the pieces of paper on the press to put the ink on paper, typesetters using different characters to form lines, binding books in a particular binding, And by looking at books this way, also highlighting the range of actors and practices involved in producing books. So in a sum, studying the making of an early printed book is taking into account the people involved in its production, giving attention to local circumstances, materials, tools, technologies, looking at specific genres and how they convey in a particular way information to readers, what the intended readership is and what the actual readership is are two different things, as well as modes of distribution and the use of books, which can go beyond the readership. If we're looking at the Spanish viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, so the missionaries end up there starting late 15th century. I think I'm missing a slide. But it's only until 1539 that the first printing press was installed in Mexico City in New Spain, and even much later in the 1580s in Lima in the Viceroyalty of Peru. But printing was not something you could just do, of course. Both the secular and the ecclesiastical authorities were keeping a close eye on what was being printed to regulate what knowledge was circulating. And this was no other with these missionaries' books on and in indigenous languages. Even more so, it appears that there was a very strict mechanism to ensure that what was circulating in these books was checked. And you needed, in the early modern period, two kinds of approval to get your books published, which is the ecclesiastical approval, an approbation, so a permission by a local archbishop or a bishop. And in the case of the missionary books, also order provincials had to give their approbation to get books published, usually the provincials of a particular missionary man in the local context that he knew of. Then on the other hand, you had the royal privileges and licenses, many times just combined in one statement. The privilege gives you the exclusive right to print books within a particular period of time, ensuring that nobody else would print these books and take away your profit. The license is the actual permission, so it's combined with the privilege to print these books. And both types of authorizations, they were based on reports made by expert reviewers who were assessing these books before publishing. Of course, that nothing against the Catholic faith was in it, because especially with the religious translations, it concerned religious texts, and it was important that these indigenous peoples were converted into the right faith. But what is interesting to see is the same went for grammars and vocabularies and phrase books. In Europe, those kinds of books did not need ecclesiastical approval because it was not non-religious by nature. So it's interesting to see that the authorities realized for these missionary books, even though it were linguistic books by nature, they had to be checked to see whether nothing was wrong against the Catholic faith. And then what is also different from Europe is that these experts were assessing the accuracy, the linguistic accuracy of these books, that what the knowledge that was conveyed was actually the correct linguistic terms, that they were not conveying wrong information about local languages. And how did they do so? The experts were usually fellow missionaries in the field who had to read these texts through for their superiors, usually colleagues even within the same mission post, to make sure that the knowledge was conveyed correctly. And this is how this looks like in the books, because from the middle of the 16th century onwards, printers were obliged to take up these statements and print them in the books, which is then a gold mine of information to see how this very strict regulatory process actually worked. And we see that the review process, after looking into hundreds of these types of materials, we see that it was very systematic, very universal, and they all looked into the same thing: structural conformity, linguistic accuracy, but also formal qualities, how the book looked like, Was it comprehensible enough for fellow missionary men? And what was the author's reputation? So these reviewers functioned not only as imposing censorship, but as some sort of quality control. With these statements, you had some sort of quality mark that the book that you were reading was a good book. If you did not get this permission, of course, the book would not be published and would not circulate. So it was very important to have these statements. Here is the slide I was looking for before. So I've told you before, the printing industry in the Viceroyalties was also very specific for the area. And we can see that the control of both the Spanish crown and the church was very strict in these areas. In Mexico City, you have the first printing office in 1539. And then moving on through the century, we see that it remains a small network of printers, usually family members of people who know each other, who are all working in the first place for the church and the crown. So they were very much printing on demand. In Lima, it's even smaller. The first printing press only arrives in the 1580s, which is really late. And I think in the first decades, it's just only one printing office closely tied to the Jesuits. And only in the 17th century, I think you end up with 3 or 4 printing offices. So a very, very small printing industry, and only serving, or what they were printing was so closely tied to the colonial project, what would serve both the crown and the church and the universities. And if we look at the missionary books, we see that, of course, that's why they were printed there, because they were closely tied to this project of the church, converting the local peoples. And interestingly, there was little outsourcing in Europe, while we see for other types of genres that authors in New Spain and Peru would resort to Europe to have their books published. In this case, it happened almost in New Spain, it didn't happen. In Peru, because the printing industry arrived so lately, it happened a few times. A couple of editions ended up being printed in Europe, but mostly they did not do so. And the case why they did not print missionary books in Europe was exactly because you did not have the expert proofreaders, the expert reviewers assessing this linguistic accuracy. They were unavailable in Europe. If you want to print books in indigenous languages, you need typesetters who know these languages. And of course, in Europe, nobody knew all these different kinds of languages. So you keep your knowledge circuit closely tied to where the languages are spoken. So it ends up being what I call a specialist book market. It's printing on demand. So we see that a lot of these books are not published because an author wanted to see his book published. They're published because an author was ordered to write and publish a book. And in many cases, it's either the archbishop or the provincial that requests a book, a grammar, a vocabulary in a particular language to be published. And this is an example how we can see. This is a missionary in the dedication of his Mixtec vocabulary who says, before this quote, he says, "Oh, I was very reluctant to take up this work to compile a word list of this language, but you encouraged me to do so." And in the next sentence, he even said, I owe you everything because you ordered me to have this book printed, to bring other people in relation with this language. So you really see that there was this very top-down printing on demand. We need to have these books available for our fellow missionary men in the field. Okay, and now we're going to the fun part. One of the things I always have to tell cultural historians is the importance of the people working in the printing office and what impact they actually had on the final product of the book. This research is on the crossroads of book history, missionary linguistics, and translation studies. And I still see that linguists tend to look at the author did this, the author did that. But if you look into the books themselves, I'm a book historian. I don't look at contents. I look at how the book is structured. And if you look at those things, you actually see the hands of the people that made these books separate from the author. And you can easily see how much impact and influence that they had on what knowledge was circulating through these books in all kinds of ways, unintentional, but also intentional actions before and during printing, how they were making choices to represent words and vowels and sounds in indigenous languages, and how even after printing, by correcting stuff, they made sure that different kinds of knowledge was circulating from one edition, but we'll go deeper into this now. This statement really summarizes this in a nutshell. Is the author writing in his grammar of the Puripecha language that at one point he wanted a particular sound, but he chose to have it written as a double R to avoid any unusual character that printing presses usually lack. So he actually shows that typographical choices also depended on the capacities of the printing office. And he avoided using new characters, explicitly actually stating that creating these new types was unfeasible. The printers did not possess them, nor did they have the means to produce new type. And it shows that the printing office affected how readers would engage with these sounds and how this sound was then codified to people learning the language. And before 1700, we actually see only a very small number of editions introducing new typographical characters. So mostly what printing offices did was use modified characters by combining matrices, but most texts just relied on Latin letters, ligatures, and diacritics to invent or to convey non-European sounds. I'm saying so much wrong terminology, I'm sure. So the material limitations of this very small printing industry in New Spain and Peru directly constrained the written representation of indigenous languages for the readers. This is the interior of a printing shop. It's an idolized one by Stradamus, a great print that we have in Museum Planta Maritas if you ever want to visit. And it goes to show how many hands were involved in the making of a book. And how busy it actually was. And the more people you have working on a product, the more chances are that these people also impact on how the product looks like, mistakes are made, etc. And if we just look at all these different men separately, on your left on top, you have the master printer. A text comes in, he oversees the production process, but also technically decides on the format that a book is printed in, what materials are going to be used, what type, etc., and how the book will be structured with headings, etc. The second one is what we call the editor, who could have been the author, maybe a copyist, or a proofreader. He takes the manuscript that has come in and adapts it to the house rules and prepares what we call a printer's copy that already uses the layout, the chapters, the type, illustrations or not, all the structure that is needed for the typesetters to just typeset the text how it should come off the presses. This is, of course, an important part in the stadium because it in the process because it affects in the way in how a text is presented. And it's important to realize that this happens in the printing office mostly with the decisions made by a master printer and not the author. Of course, the author had his say in the process, but it was the master printer who was worrying about commercial gains from printing, using paper in an efficient way, because paper was the biggest investment in the printing office, and making sure that this product was his product. Then the third picture are the typesetters. usually working in the most printing offices, more than one typesetter was active, so they were working together. And we see in the business archives of Christoph Planten and his successors at the Planten Press in the museum, that an edition was not just typeset by one person, it was a day job. And it could mean that one day one compositor was typesetting a text, and the next day another took on the job and took over the job, and resulting in different typesetters creating these editions. Of course, setting text in type means also choosing letter spaces, punctuation, choosing abbreviation, depending on how long lines could be, how long the page could be, determining spelling because there was no fixed orthography, and also impacting the structure and the visual layout. Then you have the pressmen. They prepare the ink and operate the printing press. The proofreader here, he checks the proof sheets before a full print run. Usually the first printed sheet is checked by the proofreader, but the pressman and the inkman, they don't stop printing because time is money. They have to move on. So while the proofreader is correcting, they keep on printing, resulting in what we call different states in an edition. The uncorrected states were not just discarded because paper cost money, which results in different readers maybe having uncorrected copies of an edition and corrected ones. Then you also have the printer's devil, the assistant who did jobs like carrying buckets of water, redistributing type to the type cases, or gathering the sheets in the correct order. All of these people impact the way how these books were being made. A printer's devil could make mistakes in the gathering, ending up in pages being in the incorrect order before sewing it all together. If we look at the, how much time do I have?
You're good.
Okay.
But we're starting late.
Okay, if we then look at some examples, you can really see how they impact how the book is being presented to readers. These are 4 editions of the Quechua grammar that was first published in 1586 by Antonio Ricardo, then in 1603 in Seville, then in 1604 by Antonio Ricardo in Lima again, and then in the latest one in 1614 by his successor in Lima, Francisco del Canto. And at first sight, it looks very similar, but you see how multiple editions have some changes in it. The second edition, you see, what is important is that they are reusing earlier editions to print the new edition. So making a cast-off copy was easy if you just had a printed version next to you to determine the layout, but they did not do mechanically. Printers and compositors, they did influence how the content was organized. And you see this especially in the third edition, printed by Antonio Ricardo. He introduced italics and a distinction between Roman and italics to distinguish between languages. So he really thought about readability and clarity for the reader if you compare it with his first edition, which did not happen in the second edition. And then what is interesting to see is the final edition. What they did do in the second edition in Seville is they changed the order of the book. So in the first edition, you first have a grammar and then a vocabulary. The Sevillian printer decided to switch and first have the vocabulary and then the grammar. In 1614, the last edition, strange to see that Francisco del Canto takes the first edition as his example to print a book instead of the third edition that was printed in Lima. So he removes the typographical distinction between the languages again, and he goes back to Roman type alone. So you clearly see that his cast of copy was based on the 1586 edition and not the 1604 edition, which is strange because this really improved the readability of the book. This is a second example of how to see how in the printing office the layout choices directly affected readability. This is a catechism of the linguistic language. And so it's basically a word-by-word translation of the catechism with Latin on your left and the linguistic translation on your right. And by using a consistent heading, fonts, and the illustrations, the woodblocks that you see, you had visual markers to guide the reader. So the reader knew what actual word he was reading when he was looking at these two facing pages. And the images really reinforce the fact that you're on this page, on this line, on this particular word. But interestingly to see is that the linguistic translation apparently needed more space to convey the same message. So they fixed it by adding 4 lines of ornaments in the Latin translation so as to not disrupt the layout of the book. Layout choices could also reduce readability, and we see this in the case of this Chibcha confession manual, which has a fairly atypical structure. The manual first lists sentences in Spanish and is then followed by indigenous translations, but these references are numbered, and what you had to do as a reader is to look at the number and then check before at the Spanish translation to see what you were actually reading. And this was a wish that the author had expressed to have this done this particular way. But the master printer decided to use a fairly large type for a fairly small bibliographical format, an octavo. So there was only very few lines on a particular page, and it results in a very impractical layout because you constantly had to go back and forth to see the Spanish translation.
Sharing your screen.
Oh, okay. I'll check. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Is it back?
Yes.
Okay. And you see that the reader agreed with the fact that it was this particular reader agreed with the impractical layout because he decided to add the Spanish sentences in the margins of the book. Printers, of course, used existing typographical materials given the limitations that they had, especially in the viceroyalties. And they even copied entire structures of earlier editions for efficiency because you really it was easier to make your cast of copy based on something that was already printed. And we can see this in this comparison of a title page of a Nahuatl vocabulary on your left and a title page of a Purepecha vocabulary printed a few years later on your right. Both of them were printed by the same printer. And we know that Materino Gilberti, who was responsible for the Purepecha vocabulary, modeled his work on Molinas's work. So what I think he did is he had the vocabulary at his disposal and he added the Purepecha translation in the margins maybe, and then gave this to the printing office to provide his vocabulary to be printed. Easy for Juan Pablos, the printer, because he could rely on this earlier edition to have a new vocabulary of a new language printed. But we also see that he added some changes. So these two, the first two, are the Spanish indigenous language sections. And even though you see that they look very similar layout-wise, he introduced some elements that improved readability, like adding spaces, adding an initial letter for each entry of a new letter of the alphabet, running titles, etc. But what is more interesting to see is that the Purepecha Spanish part that was added to the vocabulary had a completely different layout in the same book, which you see on your right. And that is because there was no cast-off copy. The vocabulary of Nahuatl only contained the Spanish Nahuatl version and not the other section. So Pablos really invented this new section then, and you see that the layout is so much better and easier to use. So even within one edition, they're progressing in how to convey these different words to readers. And then what I think is interesting to see is where you see the hands of the typesetters. Of course, typographical errors were common during typesetting, and errors could result from misreading the manuscript or confusing between letters. And this is a very common mistake that you see. The author's name is Juan de la Anunciación, but the typesetter accidentally put in Ila instead of de la. And it's not necessarily that the compositor made the mistake while typesetting, but likely it's that the printer's devil, who was responsible for redistributing type into the type case, redistributed the letters E in the incorrect compartments, because typesetters really could blindly set type and they knew where every letter was. But it really shows how material practices in the printing office directly produced errors in the text. And you could say, well, this is not a big deal. This is just a minor mistake. It does not make any, it's no problem, except when they do it with the indigenous words. And especially when they do it with the indigenous words affecting the pronunciation of the word. Which one is then the correct way to pronounce this word? And we see it in this Nahuatl grammar. The catchwords on your left side is tie, to refer to the first word on your recto side, but that includes an O. Which one of these is then, for a reader who does not know the language, the correct spelling of this part of the word? And how did this happen? Is that because the typesetter was working too quickly? Was he tired? Was he a bit careless? Did he make some memory errors while typesetting? Did he maybe not understand the indigenous words? And it again shows the real impact of these typesetters on the text. But chances are he knew the indigenous languages, and that you can tell by the next example. These are 4 editions of Alonso de Molina's vocabulary, 2 editions, and his grammar, 2 editions, but they all contain numeral lists, a list with numerals, I'm sorry. And what is interesting to see is all of them are printed at different print shops. And one word, the word for tree, appears differently in each of these editions. And you could say, well, maybe the author progressed in the way how you could spell the words, but it's very interesting to see that he would then do so for 4 editions. So I don't think it's the author changing the way you could spell the word tree. I think it's the typesetters that did so, because we know, based on some sources, indigenous typesetters were being employed in these printing offices. And we know of native children going to colleges to learn Latin, to learn the Latin script, to learn to write and codify Nahuatl in the Latin script. And we know that they were being employed as bookbinders, as scribes, but also as proofreaders and typesetters. And I think you can see an actual example of this, especially when you look at the 3rd example, A, because you could say the Y and the I, they don't change pronunciation. So it's just a choice of a typesetter choosing what letter he would prefer. But the A actually influences the pronunciation of the word. And we know it's it's maybe not the most common way in the early modern period to spell the word tree, but we know that they did so. So you actually see that this is a typesetter deciding to typeset the word tree in this way, in a way that he was maybe more familiar with in pronouncing the word. As I said, most books relied on Latin ligatures, diacritics to typographically represent vowels and sounds that are not known in Europe. And there are only a few cases that they did invent new characters, but how did they go about then? They used adaptations and new characters were only rarely introduced. The reasons for using Latin script is, some languages had close phonetic correspondence with Spanish, but also it was technically very difficult and very costly to create new type. Especially these printers in New Spain and Peru, they had limited typefaces and equipment available. All that they had was relying on available stock that they imported from Europe. There were some typesetters in New Spain, but we know most of the type just came from Europe, even from, again, the Planten Press in Antwerp. And even in Europe, creating new type required specialized punch cutters, and it was something that was done very consciously. Most printers just bought the fonts that were available and were common, and not many printers were actually requesting new type to be made or specific types to be made. It was not easy accessible. And how did they then go about? In this example of a Mapudungun grammar, you see that at one particular point, the author wants to convey a special consonant. And he says, I'm not creating a new letter, but we've used a letter G with an accent on it, which they probably did by combining punches to create this modified type to convey the sound like a hard G that you would use. So you see that there's probably has been this negotiation between the printing office and the author on how can we represent this sound without having to make new type that we cannot make. A more interesting case is then, this is an example of new type that has been created specifically for a particular sound. Which was called by the author the inverted Y. He was able to do so because he had very rarely his grammar of the Chibcha language printed in Europe and not in Peru. And the printer, Bernardino de Guzman, was able, so because he had access to inherited type, he had an in-house type founder. So he actually worked with a type founder to create this new type, who was Juan Godard. Despite this, the use of new characters remained limited. So he only used a new type for this particular sound. And it's interesting to see that he never used it again in other editions. So this is the only edition that we see this new type used. So I guess he really had to think about what was the effort in making this new type, and would it be interesting for him to, as a printer, to sell this book as a commercial product. So it remained a one-time solution. And even so the innovation was restricted by cost, practicality, and limited reuse. And that's probably why they only created one new type. And then if we look at the use of the type, we see there's inconsistent use of it, of the inverted Y. Sometimes the typesetter used the inverted Y when he actually wanted to use a regular Y. So he was mistakenly using this character in Spanish words. We also see that sometimes when they actually had to use inverted Ys, they used regular Ys, probably because there were only a limited amount of these type characters, and they had to resort to the remaining ones that they did have. But also these are European compositors who probably did not know the indigenous language, maybe because they were reading from the manuscripts, sometimes mixed up, is this inverted Y or not? And resorted to the regular Y. This is based on the proof, the errata list that you find at the end of the book, that you can see the errata list says you have to actually spell it like this instead of this, which proves that probably the proofreaders and the typesetters lack the knowledge of the indigenous language. I'm going very fast because I think I have to finish. Yeah? Okay. Even after printing, these editions continue to be altered. As I said before, it was possible that one reader could purchase an uncorrected state of an edition compared to another reader having a corrected state of an edition, which means they had access to different copies, maybe sometimes different spelled words, affecting again how they would learn the indigenous languages. And this is an interesting case to see of an edition that was printed with 2 different title pages. And that's because, and in the first instance, it was only intended to have a vocabulary of Quechua printed. And while they were printing, the author apparently added a grammar section that was then including in the process. And it's interesting to see because we usually say that title pages were printed after the main text was printed. I don't think this was the case in this example, because if you look at the quires, it makes sense. The bibliographical collation formula makes sense if you look at how the archive responds to what was happening here. So they later incorporated without updating paratexts as well as the title page. The grammar section was the final section, and it was intended to be a part of it. But the print run did contain title pages without the mention of the grammar, influencing also readers what they would see, what the book was about. And this is then my mysterious case that I've not been able to resolve. Even entire editions could be reworked after printing, producing 2 versions within the same date. This is an Aymara grammar that exists today in different holdings in 2 different versions. They differ in layout, typography, foliation, and also content. And it seems that the second image is completely reset from the first edition, but thoroughly revised. But they still decided to add the same dates on the title page, which is time-wise impossible. If we look at the differences, you see initial letters being used. Here, I don't know if you see it, but the catredatico is misspelled and corrected in the new one. But most interestingly, there is a copy that exists that contains corrections that they're then added in the later edition. And it is believed that this may have been the author correcting a printed copy of an edition to rework it as a new edition. More examples here, but it really impacts the contents and how the indigenous words are displayed. Here he adds an H, it's included. The uzu is included. So apparently there was this preliminary edition in circulation. What I believe is that the author was not content with what he had published or that his knowledge had progressed over time. Or it's also possible that there was a new print run after there was a large demand. Maybe there was a loss of stock and they needed new copies. And because the author was not pleased anyway, he decided to revise the entire thing. But then it's very strange to see that they still use the same dates. And also interesting to see that the printer did not request a new privilege for the second edition. So probably the privilege, which was usually for a limited period of time, 5 years, 10 years, had already expired. And so maybe the printer decided then to act as if it was the same edition to illicitly publish the book without a privilege. Everything is possible. This is a boring slide, I think. It's my summary to say, don't look at just what the author does in books. It's different sets of individual interventions that really impact on what knowledge is being circulated and being presented to readers, and also proofreaders and typesetters, the most invisible people in the early modern period. We know nothing about them, but we see their hands in the actual products. So it's worthwhile to take into account even different copies of the same edition, because you will find differences. And these differences are all related to what happened in the printing office. And of course, print production did not fix texts in permanent forms. They did not create identical copies. These, as I've proven, the copies are different and continue to be altered by readers. And I think that's also important, that readers also engage with the contents, add notes, add linguistic knowledge. So every particular copy of an edition is important because it all contains this unique object telling the history of the book, but also how there's being engaged with the book beyond what the printer intended to convey to the reader. Thank you.
Do you have any questions or comments from the audience? Green.
I was just wondering if there's any field trace shows that how, maybe you mentioned that how indigenous people was characterful associated with the productions, or maybe the language. And I have a second small question. Are these both have a consistent format?
So first question is evidence of indigenous hands. We know so based on external sources. There was this college of, sorry for my pronunciation, Tlatelolco, and their native young men were trained not only in the Latin script and Nahuatl, but we know based on sources that they were also employed there in a local printing office as typesetters and proofreaders. Some missionary men thank indigenous proofreaders in their prologues. I think only 2 in New Spain do so, and they mention them by name. Oh, thank you so much for correcting my work, blah, blah, blah. So based on these external sources, we know them, but we don't see them, of course. They will never take the agency in the books because they were not allowed to. And the second question is, depending on the genre, there were some conventions already in use in early modern Europe, catechisms that were usually folio format because it was used as to read on lecterns or at your study table, while vocabularies were had to be easy to carry with you. So most of them are in a smaller format, so you can take it in your pocket while going to a mission post. So it's depending on the genres that they had specific layout conventions. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Thanks, that was lovely and interesting. I have a question about whether the books in the universe of missionary work were they treated as status symbols, and sort of were they maybe were they depicted as objects of as props in sort of scenes of missionary work, or what was the sort of cultural status of books beyond the kind of primary function of using evangelizing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as with liturgical books, these books were not readers' books. You did not read them from A to Z. These were objects of use. You used them, so they were very practical, like you would use a dictionary in a different country because you need to look up that word. And I think that's the same. They convey practical knowledge that they had to know when they were communicating with indigenous communities. So cultural status, I don't think they held high prestige in libraries. Of course, in later centuries, people developed some sort of antiquarian interest towards these, and we see that in libraries from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries that in inventory lists that they're listed as, very old book in the indigenous language, but in the first sense, they were really practical books that you would need if you were to convert people. So they did not go beyond that specific status. No. Yeah, and it's the same with, we see only a few of them in the early modern period circulating in Europe because they were of no interest for European readers. So the knowledge circuits were really restricted in the first phase to the missionaries themselves. And there's this Pedro de Arenas, he even complains about the fact that they are of no use in daily communication. So he writes his own grammar of Nahuatl, includes word lists that you can actually use if you want to correspond with these people. So you really see that they're, and that's why I maybe stressed it too much, I'm sorry, closely tied to the evangelization project. Yeah. The same as liturgical books. There are also no books of reading. These are objects of use in the church. Yeah.
The amount of state control over what books could and could not be published is extensive. I was surprised to hear that, because in my mind, that could be something that could only be exerted in like the 1800s, but this is happening much earlier.
Well,
But I imagine it's not perfect. And in the previous slide, you mentioned that someone changed the date so that it was all right to circumvent this. How much evidence do we have literary underground in the Spanish colonies?
Because it was such a small and strict environment, I think it's very difficult to devote your printing office to circulating sorry, I'm missing the word. Yeah, thank you. Those kinds of books. But of course, it happened everywhere. We also know that Christophe Planten, even though he was the king's printer, even though he published the Index of Forbidden Books, he was also printing illicit books. So every printer did, but you have to find traces. And I think that's difficult in the case of this environment. And it may be that because they were so restrictive, there's little opportunity. Especially the Spanish crown was really keen on conveying only the correct information. So also in the Netherlands that were part of the Spanish Empire and the viceroyalties, they experienced this very restrictive censorship. And by all means, yeah. But in a small printing industry, I think it's way more difficult to circulate books. If you're the only printing office in Lima and they find a printed book that's not allowed, well, you know who it did. Yeah.
I'm just stand up that way because Lawrence first.
Thank you. I'm assuming that no type founding took place in the Americas until much later. And I wonder if it might have happened on a really small scale, for example, for the special characters, like that seems to me would have been possible with local materials and artisans to add some special sorts.
Yeah, we know that the third printer, Antonio de Espinosa, was actually trained as a type founder when he arrived in New Spain. And I think it happened, but on a very limited basis. And they only started relying on local type foundries to convey indigenous languages with their own particular characters in the 18th century. So I think it's limited capacity, too small of an industry to also make it viable to operate as an independent type foundry. It was cheaper to just purchase type from the Plantin Press in Antwerp.
Is there a way to tell the difference between something that initially that happened in print shop floor versus something that was a change in how missionaries were hearing the language? Because there's a well-known phenomenon among missionaries and later ethnographers that contributed to the attribution of Europeans by Europeans that these folks are savages, et cetera, that their languages are broken because the sounds shift all the time. And the missionaries were hearing these sound shifts that, oh, one day this person says it with a and the next day they say it with a ooh. Therefore, they don't even have a normal language. When in fact, it was the missionaries' ears that were broken. They were hearing it through, in this case, would be through the Spanish phonology. And so there's all the records all over among missionaries and ethnographers where the spelling of indigenous languages shifts pretty consistently. But it's coming from their kind of like they're listening and trying to figure out what letter fits. So the way that you presented it was that there's a lot of stuff going on in the print shop, which is undoubtedly true, but could there be other stuff going on?
Are you referring to the word tree, the yay?
Yeah, it is among some of the indigenous, yeah, that's the example that comes up, but I assume that there are other examples in
But
setting the like Nakwa.
in the case of the catchwords are intended in the first place for typesetters to typeset in the correct place, and for bookbinders to see when they're binding the books that the pages are in the correct order. So it's very necessary that your catchword refers to the exact same words, because otherwise the binder, the gatherer, or even the typesetter would be confused. So I understand what you're saying, but the examples that I show, I think directly relates to the printing office, especially also with the 4 editions of the Nahuatl grammar. Where is it? I have too many slides. Yeah, that one. This is the 3rd edition, and this is the 4th edition. So the last edition would then return to the old ways of spelling, which would also be weird if it's related to.
That's one of the things you see. It's their fault. They don't vary just in one direction. They can go backwards. I'm just putting.
Yeah, but I think you have to consider it's 2 vocabularies, 2 grammars that have been reissued again, and the entire book looks completely the same. There's no major revisions, which seems to imply that the author did not really change or the way he was thinking about what he was putting up for sale. It was just a popular book because it was at the time the only vocabulary and the only grammar of that language in print. And so probably they just wanted new copies because people were asking for it. So in this case, I also do believe it's something that happened at the printing office, but I don't disregard what you say, of course. And of course, we could see it, especially if we're looking at grammars written by different missionary authors. There, you could trace such differences, I think. Alonso de Molina, in particular, he arrived in New Spain when he was a small child. So he grew up with the indigenous community from early on. And he also says, so, oh, it must be so difficult for missionary men if they have to learn this language at an adult age. I was a child, so I know it very well. So I think this doesn't go up for this particular case, if that makes sense.
I'm going to hold the rest of the questions because we have a bit in the schedule. Please catch on at one of the breaks. Please let me know if you wanted.
I'm sorry I was so long.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you very much again.